9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Hello, and welcome to Deep State Radio. This is Rosa Brooks, and I'm standing in today as host of the Mothership podcast because David Rothkopf, our fearless leader, is mysteriously unavailable. Now, normal people, when they can't make a scheduled podcast, say something like, I have a dentist appointment or whatever. But because this is Deep State Radio and we in the Deep State don't have to give that kind of explanation, I'm just going to say, he is in an undisclosed location. But that doesn't matter because the original crew from Deep State Radio is right here with me, and I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order just to prove that we in the Deep State do know the alphabet. I'm going to start with Ed Luce from the Financial Times. Welcome, Ed.
Hello, Rosa. Lovely to be with you.
And then I've got a little challenge because both David Sanger and Kori Schake have names beginning with S, but I'm going to do what I was taught when I was in grade school. I'm going to go to the second later. I'm going to say that David Sanger, you come next in the alphabet from the New York Times. Welcome, David.
There's no way I could come ahead of Kori Schake under
only
any
alphabetically.
Circumstances. Only alphabetically. That's the only way it would work. Yeah.
And finally, last but not least, of course, we have Kori Schake from the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome, Kori.
Hello, my friends.
And this is going to be our back to basics show, as I started with, displaying our command of the letters of the alphabet and the ability to alphabetize. Let's go back to basics on foreign policy and just say what the fuck is going on right now. And all sorts of crazy things are happening. Let me start by talking about, I think we want to talk about what's going on in Ukraine, but let me just start with what is going on with Trump's nominees. And I'd like each of you, and I'm going to go in reverse alphabetical order, starting with you, Kori, just to show that I'm really good at this. Who is your very favorite Donald Trump nominee thus far? And in what way are you frightened for U.S. foreign policy and national security?
I presume you are being sardonic on favorite.
Yeah,
and so I'm interpreting it as who is the worst / most dangerous. And I would have to say the Attorney General nominee, because the country's chief law enforcement officer is an incredibly important post and has the ability to use coercion and intimidation against fellow Americans. I suspect you might have guessed I would have said the nominee to be Defense Secretary. But the Defense Department is better capable of holding up an incapable nominee than other departments because of the professionalism of the military and the civilian workforce in the department. So I'm actually, even though I think Pete Hegseth would be a surprisingly unqualified choice to lead the $780 billion a year business with 2.2 million employees and tens of thousands of real property items. I'm going to go with Matt Gaetz.
All right. It's a sort of target-rich environment in terms of choosing the most dangerous. So I appreciate that you had to make some tough choices, and Matt Gaetz is not an unreasonable choice. How about you, David Sanger?
Well, I would have chosen that, but since Kori's taken Matt Gaetz off the table here, I think I have to cast my vote for most interesting nominee to be Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence, somebody who over the years has pretty well spouted Russian talking points on everything from the Ukraine invasion to the theory, which she later backed away from halfway, that the United States was building a biological weapons factory in Ukraine, which was, of course, a piece of propaganda that the Russians themselves put out there. So she would be in the post that has to evaluate the most complex intelligence issues that we face, separate out disinformation from real information, oversee the presidential daily brief, make sure that we have our assessments about Iran's nuclear capability and terrorism issues and Russian intentions and China's grand strategy to be just right. And we have somebody who has, at various moments, seized on many a conspiracy theory. So I think for a nominee where you sort of say, "What?" I mean, that would be it. But one other thing I just add to this briefly, Rosa, is this is such a different process than 8 years ago when Trump was picking his first cabinet. When he picked his first cabinet, he wanted to get people who looked like they were out of central casting, he would frequently say, but who were essentially establishment figures being placed in new roles. So think Rex Tillerson. Nobody was arguing he was Thomas Jefferson and ready to be Secretary of State, but he certainly had wide international experience and had managed an organization as big or bigger than the State Department. Jim Mattis at the Defense Department, had been four-star head of Central Command. Nobody argued for a moment that he wasn't superbly qualified to be in the job. What you're seeing now are nominees who are basically being put there because they're being told, because they've either been great critics of the agency they're doing or are outright out there to dismantle parts or all of those agencies.
Ed?
Well, I would say the cupboard is getting bare, but it really isn't. The choice remains quite rich. So I'm going to go just marginally for RFK Jr. as Secretary for Health and Human Services. I just wrote a column, in fact, sort of bringing out the early Octavian Caligulan analogies between Trump and between early decline of Rome and Trump 2.0. And of course, Caligula famously, although possibly apocryphally, nominated his horse to be a senator. And I didn't make the point that Americans might come to wish that Trump had appointed a horse to be Secretary of Health and Human Services, because what RFK Jr. stands for and what he believes, very politely described as a vaccine skeptic in the media. A skeptic, in my book, is somebody who challenges knowledge, who needs sort of real empirical stress testing and takes a lot of persuading. He's an anti-vaxxer fantasist. He repeatedly disseminates views that have been debunked comprehensively, such as the link between all kinds of vaccines. And we're talking way pre-COVID here in terms of his vaccine skepticism, denialism. The link between vaccines and autism sort of being one, but all kinds of other sort of sweeping conspiracy theories around how public science works. Fluoride in water, the idea that it's antidepressants from big pharma that is caused mass shootings in schools, not guns, or other sort of obscure explanations that might be available. So he's a full-blown conspiracist with sort of genuine power over the CDC, the NIH, the FDA, and I think also the genuine potential to be a teachable moment for Americans about just how important these largely unknown three-letter agencies are in upholding public health and their children's health and so forth. So, I would rather a horse for any of the names mentioned so far, but the line works perfectly for Robert Kennedy Jr.
Well, let me ask you all a politics question. One of the lots of discussion in the media and lots of discussion in sort of DC political circles and amongst nonprofits about whether these various people will get through Senate confirmation, and lots of energy devoted to the, analyzing sort of the usual kind of horse race stuff of, which, if any, senators might be inclined to try to block any of these nominations. We haven't really talked about Pete Hegseth at defense. Kori's more sanguine than I am about the Pentagon's ability to withstand potentially 4 years of Pete Hegseth, but either way, right? And I mean, all four of these clearly are really raising alarm bells for lots of people, and the energy is sort of focused on the confirmation battles. My own take is that this is kind of irrelevant because number one, I suspect that even if one or more of these four particularly frightening potential nominees get sunk and doesn't make it through the confirmation hearing, that Donald Trump has people who are essentially just as awful waiting in the wings, who he would pull out next. And I can't see enough Republicans in the U.S. Senate having the stomach. I can see them having the stomach to go up against Trump on one or two nominees. You know, maybe it's Gates, right? Maybe it's Tulsi Gabbard. Who knows? Maybe it's Kennedy. But I can't see them turning him down multiple times in a row, number one. So I suspect that energy going into trying to defeat them through the confirmation process is not super well spent. It'll be a brief temporary victory, which will then be followed by, you know, some new nominee who's just as bad. Plus, it's not particularly clear to me that Trump won't simply make use of recess appointments, as he has suggested he will do, possibly even browbeating the Senate going into recess in order to make recess appointments, or use acting appointments or something like that. So what's your take on, is this something that we should be, is this just everybody delusionally thinking that we're still in business as usual, where things like confirmability and confirmation battles matter when in fact they really don't, because we're way past that? Or is there still some value in trying to raise these issues in terms of the coming Senate confirmation hearings? And let me go to you again, Kori, first.
Sure. I think there's enormous value in forcing the president to abandon constitutional and normative and legal processes well established. I think it's important. I despaired to see inspectors general resign in anticipation of being fired, because I think the more people who have to be fired in order to clear the way for extra legal, extra normative, or extra constitutional processes, the louder a signal it sends about the corrosion of democracy. So I too worry both about acting appointments seriatim, as instead of nominating people who are confirmable. I also worry that the Senate may congratulate itself on refusing, for example, the Attorney General's appointment, and then be confident they have upheld their constitutional authority and confirm everybody else. So I think there are lots of bad options out there. And the president's threat to do a cute legal trick of declaring the Congress in recess, that should be taken to court if the president does it, because there's no way that the people who are original interpreters of the Constitution believed that they were putting that in place for the president to circumvent the Senate's confirmation of appointees.
I also wonder, and David, maybe you or Ed wants to talk about this, the Trump administration, this hasn't been getting quite as much media attention. The incoming Trump, the transition team, has still declined to take part in the normal transition process, which would require, among other things, security clearances for some members of their transition teams planning to go into agencies that are sensitive to national security, like DOD and the intel community. They seem to be planning to, as somebody put it, it's an invading army. It's not a transition. President Trump, obviously, when he is president again, can give anybody a security clearance if he wants to. He's, as I understand the legal authorities, he has, the original authority. He doesn't need to wait and see whether some other agency says, yes, it's okay to give this person a security clearance, which in turn means that whatever doubts you or I or anybody else might have about things such as, is Tulsi Gabbard, would she be able to get a high level clearance? If he wants to give it to her, he can give it to her. But in the meantime, the fact that he is not going through the normal transition process also means that he has his nominees are not getting the normal kinds of background checks that would occur during a transition, which he doesn't seem to care what skeletons they have in their closets. But I'm wondering, as part of this discussion of whether the confirmation battles are worth focusing on at all, what should Congress be doing in terms of demanding that they receive all of the various background intelligence, FBI files, counterintelligence investigation information on all of Trump's nominees? Because clearly if the transition team is not going to do it, if that's not going to happen through that process, is that information that ought to, at a minimum, get to Congress, if not to the general public? And do you think any of that is likely?
Well, first of all, let me just start by saying that I'm so old that I remember when people got turned down in confirmation processes because they hadn't paid employment taxes for their nannies, right? Because they had, some other minor transgression, usually tax related. Things that today seem so quaint compared to accusations of drug use, accusations of sexual assault, so forth and so on. So we're in like a whole different sphere out here. Second, to get to your question, Rosa, the idea that the FBI would do a background check has been a tradition for so long that none of us really bothered to look at the fact that it's not mandated by law. So it's just been the tradition, and no one has ever thought of challenging it, including President Trump in his first term. And this is an interesting example of something that he didn't know much about when he came in before, and now he knows a lot about. So I think it's their conclusion that they can farm out the security clearance or vetting process to the degree there is one, and send it to some friendly private sector group, then have the president turn around and issue the security clearance. And they know why they're trying to go do that. Imagine for a minute here that Matt Gaetz or Tulsi Gabbard or any of a number of others, including Pete Hegseth, were applying to be a mid-level analyst in the Pentagon or an intelligence agency. What do you think the chances are that they would survive the standard security clearance procedures?
Well, and in the case of Pete Hegseth, nominee for Secretary of Defense, we already know that the Defense Department's own internal investigation viewed him as a possible insider threat as a result of his extremist ties, and therefore asked that he not be included in the National Guard units participating in President Biden's inauguration. So I think we actually know the answer on that one.
Yeah, so I think we've got a pretty good sense. And so to answer your question straight up, I think the president is probably not interested, and thus many in the Senate, the new Senate, will not be interested in having an FBI investigation whose results can leak. Now, what's the harder problem here? It's Kori's favorite, Matt Gaetz, right? Because here an investigation was just about complete, or is complete, by the House. Gaetz then resigned his House seat days before they were going to meet on releasing the report. His hope was that in doing that, he muted the issue and they wouldn't release the report. Now, this strategy has to be designed by somebody who has not lived in Ed Luce's Washington, because we know that if you withhold a report like that, it is just a giant invitation to leak bits of it, bit by bit by bit, and have sort of a long water torture event, and you're already beginning to go see that. Now, whether it leaks first to the FT or to the New York Times or the Washington Post or to the Wall Street Journal, or all four, who knows? But, once these investigations have happened, the chance that you are going to keep the results secret are somewhat south of zero.
Ed?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I mean, and therefore, I think Matt Gaetz probably will end up being the one who doesn't go through. And then, of course, your question about recess appointments, whether Trump just says, "Screw it, I'm going to have him for whatever it is." It's basically 2 years, right? Under the Vacancies Act.
Yeah.
It is. And Ed, name for me a national security official in the first Trump term who lasted more than 2 years anyway.
I believe the average tenure for any sort of Trump principal was 18 months. So that's the average. So therefore, fine. I mean, he could just do the whole lot. And of course, this exists because in the old days, people took weeks to travel to Washington, and it was just sort of impractical to expect everybody to be confirmed immediately. And so the purpose of having recess appointments would be completely traduced by doing that. And I don't know whether any of you're all way better versed on, I mean, particularly Rosa and Kori, but on the sort of legal side of this, but whether this legal system would shoot him down for misusing the spirit of the Vacancies Act, I don't know. But my larger point, I don't really have any sort of inside sort of detail about the lack of FBI background checks. But my larger point here is that personnel is policy. And this is doubly true of Donald Trump. And there is a reason why people who could not be employed elsewhere are very suitable for Trump, because their loyalty is more than just guaranteed. This is their only opportunity in life. Matt Gaetz is not going to get some big job elsewhere. RFK Jr. is not going to be running some medical research center on some big university campus. This is their only shot, and therefore their loyalty will go to the absurd levels.
You're making me feel sorry for them. So basically, they're going to be on the breadline if they can't get confirmed, and we should, as a sort of,
well, they might
for humanity, we
hunt bear or pick up dead whales from
right,
stranded whales from beaches or whatever it is to feed their families. But the idea that this is a feint by Trump, and that he then has a different deck of cards hidden under the desk. Okay, here's the slightly less outlandish names that I
or just as outlandish, or even more outlandish.
Or even more outlandish. I mean, if you've shifted the Overton windows here and you've shifted it right over there, and then you bring it back 2 degrees and say, there we are, the system works, that's compromise. I actually don't think that is what Trump is up to. I think he wants these names.
So let's think about the impact of this on national security in a different way. I mean, Ed, David, Kori, you all talk to people from U.S. allies, allied governments. What are U.S. allies doing in a world? Imagine that it's a few months from now, and Pete Hegseth is Secretary of Defense, Matt Gaetz is the Attorney General. Forget RFK for the moment. Tulsi Gabbard is DNI. We've got Radcliffe at CIA. Are U.S. allies still just as comfortable sharing sensitive intelligence information with their U.S. counterparts and sharing sensitive military information, or do you think that this has some impact on the kinds of cooperation and information we are getting from U.S. allies? Kori?
Well, I feel like that's David's wheelhouse, so I should defer to him. But I will say on the military piece of it, you're likely to see allies attempt to work through military channels in the belief that they will be more reliable, more professional. And so as a civil military issue, you're likely to see allies attempt to work in military rather than civilian channels. But David, I'd love to know what you think about the intelligence aspects.
Well, so first, on your first point, Kori, I think already you've seen the Biden administration setting them up to be able to work with Trump administration through NATO, right? By moving the money for Ukraine into NATO hands and making it harder then for the next administration to grab it back. But on the theory that having all of the other 31 members of NATO, communicating back to Washington together would give them some power of numbers. The Intel one is a lot more sensitive because usually they are more the recipients of intelligence than they are the providers of intelligence. That's not always true. The British obviously have huge intelligence capabilities and share a lot with the United States. The Germans, the same thing, but they don't have the reach that the United States has. The only hope here is that enough layers down, it has the same professional intelligence professionals to intelligence professionals relationship that exists in the military channels that Kori was talking about. The NSA has got people from GCHQ, the British equivalent, sitting in NSA offices and vice versa in Britain and so forth. So I think that will continue, but I think there will be concern, especially about Russia-related data.
Right. Yeah. Ed?
I mean, if you remember, I mean, again, David knows a lot more about this, but the preemptive, the skill with which Bill Burns, who is going to be sorely missed when he leaves Langley in January, but the skill with which Bill Burns and the CIA deployed preemptively its intelligence about Russia's invasion plans in 2022, and then thereafter about other Russian plans, in order not just to sort of forewarn people, but to mess with Russian heads, drew to some degree, and I'm not sure any of us know the extent, but to some degree on a highly placed human intelligence source in the Kremlin. What's that person doing now? What's that person thinking now? Is that person safe? And I don't know. These are questions I'm throwing out there. But the confidence with which, say, the Five Eyes, who do have a more intimate intelligence sharing relationship together than other American allies, namely America, Britain, Australia, and then Canada and New Zealand to some extent. The confidence with which they would share intelligence with President Trump, forget who he nominates, strikes me as something they've already been working through. I know MI6 has been doing this scenario as they would ordinarily do in the build-up to the election. What is our response if Trump wins? Because they've seen what he's done with highly classified documents, including, I believe, British ones that are material to Britain. And I'm not sure what the answer is, because as David says, the intelligence sharing does skew. I mean, there is an American trade surplus there in terms of information. They send out more than they receive. So how do you cope with that? You don't want to sever your ties, of course. I mean, that would be to cut off your nose to spite your face. But on the other hand, you do not want to risk your assets and you don't want to risk your national interests. So I don't know what the Solomonic answer is to this question.